We're looking tonight at Psalm 2. Hope you were able to read it in advance and somehow interact with the text in a way that's meaningful and not just, hey, what page is it on? Right? That's sort of the idea, is spending time with the text beforehand, and then we'll see what we found in it together. Let's offer a word of prayer, and then we'll get started in our study. Our Father in heaven, Lord, thank you for the wonderful day you've given us. Thank you for the health and the prosperity and the means you've given each one of us to provide for our families. Thank you for the opportunity to know who you are, to see your character, to see your rule and your dominion as we study tonight in Psalm 2. Help us to appreciate that, to respect it, to honor it in everything that we do. Father, help us to not be distracted by the kings of this world and the powers in the world around us. They are no threat to you. Help us to see them as such and to respect them as necessary, but always honor you as King. Father, we ask you to forgive us of our sins. No earthly king can do that. And we come before you for only what you can give. Lord God, thank you for this day. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so to kick off and to turn on that thing first. All right. Every so often when I have the best job in the world, I get to sit and read the Bible for a living, right? And so I get to see it in a lot of different versions. And I do not speak the Greek, but I do sometimes check on the Greek translation of the Old Testament. It's known as the Septuagint. The abbreviation is normally LXX, if you see it on a slide or something. Back between the Testaments, the Old Testament was translated into Greek, which would have been the language that they would have read it in the first century. More than likely, the scrolls that were read in the first century might have been the Septuagint. You come across some interesting word choices when they translated from Hebrew to Greek. Psalm 2:1 is one of those places. I'm going to read aloud the actual, not the Greek, but what the words mean in order. It says, a psalm to David, why did neigh the nations, and people meditate upon vain things? That's not why did neigh the nations like saying no. It's why did neigh the nations like a horse? That strike anybody as strange? Why did the nations neigh like a horse? Right? Turns out that's actually what they meant to say. The Greek word is pharoso, and it literally means to snort or to vehemently neigh. I don't know how you neigh vehemently, but apparently you can, right? You can do it with energy and vigor. What?
The horses that they would have gone into battle with would have been war horses.
Maybe.
No,
do they neigh in a menacing manner?
They'll bite and they'll kick.
I imagine.
And they're trained to actually stomp the men when they run into them.
So not a kind, gentle neighing. It's not
a gentle kid's song.
Right? But just the word choice I thought was just super fascinating. It came to be known as a phrase that means to act with rage as an uncontrolled horse. This is not just an interesting word. It's the exact word used in Acts 4 when this passage is quoted by the Christians there to describe the people that are persecuting them. They quote Psalm 2 verses 1 and 2. And it's the exact word they say in that context. It's translated rage in a lot of Bibles, or some version of that word. But it's the same word, right? Why did the Gentiles neigh? So just interesting word choice. When you read that in Acts 4, put that mental picture in your brain. Why did the nations neigh like a horse?
Oh, like the picture. Is that Mr. Ed?
I don't know whose picture it is. I didn't ask, but it is a horse neighing. There is a point to the picture, though. It's not just to be funny. It's kind of goofy, right, when you think about it. Why did the nations neigh like a horse? Why did they, snort or would do whatever horses do? That is how ridiculous it looks to God, how the nations act with regard to him. That's what it looks like from his perspective, and we're going to see that in the psalm. It is sad but funny at the same time to see the nations think they can somehow rise up and challenge God, and to God it looks like that. Like a horse that just doesn't know how to behave itself. It's really kind of a cool image Psalm 2 uses. Ryan read for us last week. Can I get a volunteer to read the first 6 verses, and then we'll find another for 7 through 12. David, if you'll take the first half. This is Psalm 2, and what version are you reading from?
Holman.
The Christian Standard Bible? Okay.
Why do the nations rebel and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed one. Let us tear off their chains and free ourselves from their restraints. The one enthroned in heaven laughs, the Lord ridicules them. Then he speaks to them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. I have consecrated my king on Zion, my holy mountain.
Okay. So 7 through 12. Someone else, please. Someone wants to pick up there? Maya waved at me first. Go ahead. 7 through 12.
I will tell the decree. The Lord said to me, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your passion. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him."
All right. Very good. What, when you had a chance to read it, or even as, if you haven't had that chance, as you hear it read aloud, if you look at it, what do you see in it? What do you notice structure-wise? What seems to be happening? What stands out to you in the psalm? It's definitely very different from number 1, right? A different subject, different way it's talked about. What do you see? What do you notice? Yes, sir.
So, at least for the structure of it, it seems that it deals with in the beginning an opposition to God, and then gives warnings against that opposition, and ultimately it ends up in your submission versus the opposition.
Right. So there's a sort of a clear, this thing's happening, and then something else is happening, and then something else, right? Yeah, you mentioned that there's some opposition to that. There's a warning against it, and then there's not a warning, the sort of the reaction to it. And then the warning there at the end. Mark, did you wave at me?
I was going to say, it begins with a warning, and then it ends with a reconciliation on it. And the tip, you need to go back and reconcile yourself back to God.
Yeah.
You know, kiss the hand, if you will. It's like you need to come back. This is where you started in rage. You need to come back.
Yeah, all is not lost. There's this moment at the end where you go, okay, now you've really messed up. You need to fix this, and here's how you're going to do it, right? Yes, sir.
You know, it's already kind of been said, but basically, as we saw back with Ezekiel, Daniel, those books, God's willingness to really draw them back for him.
Mm-hmm.
But still, there's a forgiveness there, a mercy there that exists with God and his people.
Yeah, there is a forgiveness. There's a sense of allowing them to change and come back. Who is the them here, though? Who is being allowed to change and come back? Who's being talked to in Psalm 2? Or about, you might say.
The leaders, the rulers, the kings.
Okay, leaders and rulers kind of where?
Everywhere.
The people.
Wherever the people.
Kind of everywhere, right? So is this Israel that's being talked to?
Yes and no.
Okay, why?
Well, when you look, you go back, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
Go ahead.
It's fine to go to Acts, it says David wrote those words.
Uh-huh.
So when you look at that, look at all that he dealt with in his life, with him writing these words, and yet everything that's said goes right to the time of Christ and what the religious leaders were striving to do. They weren't concerned about this being the Messiah from God if they had just looked and listened, but they were concerned about themselves, the power, and so they ignored everything they saw and was going after Christ, seeking a way to kill him.
Yeah, they have allied themselves with other nations, other rulers. When it was, and I didn't hammer this when I went through the first time, but when this is used in Acts 4, it's not nations in verse 1, it's Gentiles. They took that word in the Hebrew, which just means nations, but nations really meant other nations, just people that are not Israelites. And I think that's really the point in Psalm 2. It's why is everybody on earth who is in charge raging against God. And then the same thing at the end. Those are the people being called back. Now, if Israel's doing the same, they obviously, would fall under that category. But it's kind of addressed to everybody. Yeah.
The reason I say yes and no when I said yes and no is it's obviously to the Gentiles, but we know Israel and Judah both had horrible kings, terrible kings that created alliance with other nations and so on and so forth. So when they got themselves in those roles, it very definitely applied to them.
They became like the nations.
Yeah.
That's what they wanted desperately, and that's
Yeah.
what happened.
Exactly.
And so, yes, it does apply inwardly.
Here's the interesting part to me about it. Yes, when you read it, it seems like Gentiles, and they translated it, or Acts is the commentary on it, where they're telling you how do they interpret that.
Mm-hmm.
They interpreted it as Gentiles, and yet both here and in Acts, it's being directly applied to the Jewish leaders.
Right.
That's the interesting part about it. It's talking about Gentiles, but it's being applied to the leaders of the Jews themselves.
So Gentiles in Acts 4 is being taken as non-Christians.
Yeah.
Right? You got God's chosen people and then the rest. And those are the ones attacking them in Acts 4.
And even here, when you read the psalm here, they plotted against the Lord. Who plotted against the Lord? It was
the Jews.
See, it was the council that plotted against the Lord.
Yeah.
To put him to death.
God's people get redefined in Jesus' time as not just the Jewish bloodline, but whoever is faithful to
That's
God.
an interesting twist in how you.
All right. Excellent. You saw a lot of stuff. Anything else you want to say or bring out that you noticed? All right, one more and then we got to go.
Verse 3, I thought this was interesting. How do the nations see God? They see him like they're in prison.
Yeah.
That God represents chains to be broken free. What's happened in our own society? People look at, we need to get away from religion because it's a bondage that we can improve as a society when we get rid of religion.
Yeah, if we just we're free of all that pesky religion,
All those pesky rules.
You're right. Right. Little do they know that's exactly where the problem starts, and it goes from there. All right. So stuff in Psalm 2. This has to do a lot with kings and royalty and thrones, right? That's the language that's being used. It's addressed to kings of the earth. It describes God in royal terms. He who sits in the heavens. It sits is not just where he rests himself. It's his throne, right? He who is enthroned in heaven, you might say, is scoffing at them. And then it talks about setting the king on the holy hill. This definitely gets classified as one of called the royal psalms, or psalms that emphasize the king or the rule of the king. A lot of times it's Israel's king, but often it's a description of God as king, or his anointed as king, as you actually see both of them here in Psalm 2. The structure of it breaks down very cleanly into 4 sections. It's even the same number of lines in each section. 1 to 3 is the sort of, why are the nation taking counsel against God? They want to rebel against him. God is both, finds it funny and it infuriates him at the same time, right? That they would do such a thing. And then the counter to what they say is, I've put my king on Zion. Verse 3 is, let's tear off the bonds. And God goes, yeah, my king's on Zion. And that's it. That's the end of the discussion, you might say. Verses 7 through 9 is a really interesting section. It's almost as if the psalmist is reading the decree that God gave his anointed one. Is sort of how that reads when you go through it. I will tell of the decree, and then it just sort of starts reading like that. And then everyone's being warned in 10 through 12. We talked about this last time too. Psalms 1 and 2 open the Psalms in there, I think put there on purpose to give us 2 questions that you have to answer before you move forward. The first one is, you're going to be righteous, you're going to be wicked. Right? You're going to do right or you're going to do wrong. You're going to be on God's side or not. And then the second one is close to it, who are you going to submit to? Who are you going to serve? If you're not good on those 2 questions, the rest of the Psalter is useless to you. It may be interesting, it may be beautiful, but it's not going to have the effect it's supposed to have because you haven't submitted and you haven't decided to be on God's side of things. Did anybody notice the changes in the perspective? What I mean is like the change of the perspective of the writer. Right? Normally it's written in something like first person, second person, or third person, right? Verses 1 through 6 are all written in the third person. It's written about something, right? When you see he or she or it, normally that's third person writing. You're talking about something or a group of people, something like that. In verse 6, or in verse 7, it switches to first. Not he will do this or they will do this, I will do this, right? From the writer's perspective, I will tell of the decree. And then the rest of 7 through the end of verse 9 is sort of like it's almost like he's reading from a scroll of this is what has been established. And then in 10 through 12, it comes back to third person. Or sorry, rather second person. They're talking to the kings, right? Anyway, just it's an interesting thing to track as you go through a psalm. Who is talking? What angle is it being talked about? Also, this is a beautiful example of parallelism, where you say the same thing with different words, right? You say it in succession, sort of like a reinforcement. There's also, I think, a good pattern in verse 12, and it was just a good opportunity to mention both of these things, so we're going to do that tonight. We won't do it every time, but I do want to show you at least when it happens, and so you can appreciate it. In verse 1, well, really almost all of the verses employ this parallelism, the same thing being said a different way in each of the lines. And you sort of see that with the color coding you can see on screen there. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? Nations and peoples are the same. Raging and plotting in vain are the same. Or two different ways of saying the same thing. The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together. Again, same thing, right? Happening in succession. It's poetry, and this was the way a lot of it's written in the Old Testament. And it's kind of neat to just sort of understand what's happening. It happens again in the second half of the psalm, I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. It's the same thing. But it's being described maybe from a slightly different angle to help the reader sort of understand what's going on. Also in verse 12, this is an example of something called a chiasm, or a sort of a symmetrical pattern within the text itself. What you'll notice is the pattern is not, it's sort of from the it works from the outside in. So the beginning of verse 12 is kiss the Son, sort of the reaction you're supposed to have to the Son. The end of it is blessed are all who take refuge in him. Those two ideas go together. You are submitting to the Son at the beginning of it, and sort of the good thing that happens when you do is at the end. When you move in one layer, lest he be angry versus for his wrath's quickly kindled, right? Anger, wrath, is the next layer that points in that direction. With a pattern like this, the idea in the middle is the point. It's almost like the writer is drawing a target around some idea, and it's getting you to focus on the exact middle. Right? What's the middle of the thought here? If you don't regard this, if you don't react properly to Jesus as king, or rather God's king, what happens? You perish. Right? You perish because of wrath, and you perish because you didn't submit and do homage to him. Right? It happens a lot in the text, and I'm going to try to bring it out whenever it does. Because it's the writer's way of saying, hey, this thing really matters. Right? This was before bold and underlined and highlighted, right? They had to have other ways of showing you, this is the thought I want you to focus on. Right? And the thought in this one is, yeah, you better regard the king properly or you die. Right? Anyway, that's the thought. Okay, other things you can see just looking at Psalm 2. I like how it begins with the counsel of the wicked and it ends with the counsel of the righteous. In the beginning, the wicked are taking counsel together, trying to figure out a way to get rid of God. But the good counsel at the end of the book is, no, you don't need to rebel, you need to submit. Sort of the same thing Psalm 1 does. It gives you two sides and says you need to choose wisely. Psalm 2 does the same thing. It's interesting in Psalm 2 to note who is doing the talking. In verses 2 and 3, the rulers of the world do the talking. In verse 5, God does the talking, and in verse 7, the second half of 7 through 9, it seems like the Son or the King is talking. You get all three sort of perspectives when you work your way through the psalm. You can find this is just stuff that you'll notice as you read through. One writer noted that especially for kings in the ancient Near East. You can imagine the Egyptians did this. In fact, we know they did this. It wasn't uncommon for them to refer to their kings as God's son, or some version of that, right? Son of Baal, or son of Molech, or son of whoever, right? Nebuchadnezzar has as its root the Nebu, one of the Babylonian gods. It was common for them to do this kind of thing just in that part of the world. The Israelite kings did the same thing, but it's connected to 2 Samuel 7. This is a good point. This is a good time to go read that. 2 Samuel 7 is regarded by many to be one of the 5 most important texts in the Old Testament. It is critically important. And here's the reason why. In 2 Samuel 7 verse 12, this is part of God's promise to David. David wants to build the temple, right? And God tells him, no, you're not going to build the temple, but I will build you a house. I will raise up descendants after you, God says in this chapter. 2 Samuel 7:12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Now, who's God talking about in 2 Samuel 7? Immediately, he's talking about Solomon. He says of Solomon, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. See how that matches the language we saw in Psalm 2, right? The Lord said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. A lot of people think this psalm was used during the coronation ceremony for Israel's king, because it would kind of be on that day when he would be recognized as, you're the one fulfilling this promise from 2 Samuel 7. Today you're now God's son, in that you're God's king. You're his chosen, his anointed one. Now obviously 2 Samuel 7 points beyond Solomon, as Psalm 2 does. Right? Psalm 2 points not to Solomon, but to who? Points to Jesus. Right?
I think Acts 13, verse 33, mentioned in 2 Samuel.
Exactly. So she said Acts 13. That's one of the places where this psalm is quoted in the New Testament. This highlights the connection that they made between Jesus and this king of Psalm 2. Acts 13. I probably said Psalm 13. Acts 13. Let's see. It is verse 33. Thank you. Yeah. This he has fulfilled to us, their children, by raising Jesus, as also is written in the 2nd Psalm, you are my son, today I've begotten you. So the New Testament authors, Paul and Peter and the rest, they understood that Psalm 2 pointed eventually to the Messiah, to the Christ, the anointed one. We get to see sort of it working both ways when you look at Solomon, plus when you look at Jesus. Okay, this was a tremendous line I read. It was out of Kidner's commentary. His comment at the very end of the psalm about what you do with the king just really boils it down, right? There's no refuge from him, only in him. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, it's just, there's nowhere you can go to escape him. The only escape is to go to him and be good with him. Everywhere else gets you destroyed. Just a good way of putting that. Okay, what would the Jews have done with the psalm? What were the lessons here? What things should they have learned from it? What stands out? Yep.
One thing it should have done is it should have calmed them and reminded them that God is more powerful than any king or ruler or any army or any man-made whatever it is. Mm-hmm. As we see, God laughs. I mean, we even see some king going to another king and say, make a coalition and we'll get together and we'll be strong enough to go against God, and God laughs. Back to your horse laugh. Yeah. It's such a trivial, it's like...
It's ridiculous.
It's just like us flicking a fly away. It's that trivial.
It's like when, you know, I don't know if this ever happened to you, but when your kids were really, really small, you know, they want to fight one day, right? And they ball up their little fists, they're going to fight it. And it's humorous. Now, you obviously don't just, you know, you don't pound them. But it's funny in that moment that they would somehow in their little brain think, oh, I can challenge Dad now, right? That's how silly and ridiculous what they're doing to God is, except they're deadly serious about it. Said, we're going to get rid of God. Well, no, you're not. It's sad how misguided they are. Yes, sir.
I can't find it real quick, but this discussion makes me think, was it Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar? And he's brought out God's golden things
Yeah.
from the temple, and they're partying and drinking wine and everything, and little hymn and all that.
He thought it'd be funny to take the temple vessels and have a party with them.
Yep.
Yeah, that wasn't smart.
But
That's like golf club and lightning storm
God
dumb,
was in
right?
control.
That's not wise.
that, he was gone.
I was gonna say that if it did it, I thought it was Tower of Babel. Let's build a monument to heaven.
Yeah,
What did God do? Because he had told them,
yeah.
fulfill the earth.
Or even if we're going to stick in, he mentioned something from Daniel. What about the story where Nebuchadnezzar's walking around his palace saying, look at all this I did. Look at my power. Look at my wonders. And God turns him into a grass-eating animal for a little while to prove to him, you're not who you think you are. I am who I am, right? That's the ridiculousness of what the nations are doing. Yes, sir.
It strikes me as interesting that this, as you said, would be used in coronations potentially, when you compare that with the comments earlier that Israel wanted so badly to be like the nations around them, which the big immediate thing that they got from that was kings. And in that moment, we start with, look at all the nations around you and how stupid they are.
Yep.
So I find it super interesting that there's that like weird dichotomy between these two concepts happening right here.
Yeah, Kings wasn't the original plan, but one person put it well, God went with them even though it wasn't, not that it wasn't his idea, but it wasn't how he started things. Israel decided to go down this path and God decided to go with him and fulfill his will through an anointed king. And anyway, super interesting look at that. All right, some stuff Israelites could have done with this. Number one, it was thought to be sung during coronation ceremonies. However, there was a point in Israel's history where they're not having ceremonies anymore. After 586, they didn't crown any more kings. There were Israelites, there was a nation, but there was no king. So then you think, well, what do you do with Psalm 2? They would have eventually come to know or come to expect this to be fulfilled in the ultimate king, the one they were looking for. It may not have started that way, but over the centuries it became to be known as something that would be true about the Messiah. It is not a good idea generally to try to get rid of God's authority for one real simple reason. You're not God. You're not in his category, right? You're not in his weight class, you might say. I reminded me of Psalm 21, verse 30. No wisdom, no understanding, no counsel can avail against the Lord. Doesn't matter what you come up with or what you try or what your plan is or however many people you get together to fight against, it's just not going to happen. You are not God and you are not in his category of being. So to try to say, well, we're just going to get rid of God's authority, well, tough. That's not really going to happen, ever, right? God's plan is to rule the world and the nations through his king. And one day that kingdom will rule over all nations. You think about what the Jews would have come to expect this Messiah to do. It's no wonder when the first century rolls around, they're looking for a Messiah who would overthrow the Romans, because to their credit, this is kind of what Psalm 2 says. That the Messiah is going to rule everywhere, over everybody. And all the nations are going to try to rise up against God, and God's going to terrify him with this king that he installs on Mount Zion. A king that in verse 9 breaks with a rod of iron and dashes. They're not looking for the type of person Jesus was. They're looking for, General Patton squared, right? They're looking for somebody to come in and really clean house. The psalm was not fulfilled ultimately in the literal national sense. It was fulfilled obviously in the kingdom of Christ. That king would rule with absolute power. There would be no end to his rule. He would rule forever, right? He would rule the entire earth, and he would rule because God put him there. God ordains him as king. This was the person the Jews were looking for. And it would be real smart if you submitted to him. Right? Yes?
thought was interesting too, and it says in verse 2, when the kings of earth stand against the rulers, they gather together against the Lord and his anointed one. I looked that up before. Like, that's just another form of saying his king, right? King in the Jews would always be, or I guess whenever they would take power, they would always be anointed.
Right.
One thing to set them apart, right?
Right.
So I was thinking it's interesting when you look at the New Testament, okay? When Jesus is in Bethany, and that gal brings the oil and anoints him more or less with that expensive oil, and he tells them, stop, she is doing a good thing for me. It's interesting because they should have noticed that that type of ceremony was meant just for a king, right?
It
kind of
was
interesting concept.
anointed, usually when you see the word anointed, it has nothing to do with kings. It's priests. Priests are anointed. Aaron and his sons were anointed, right? There's the phrase, you remember, like oil running down Aaron's beard. That's the idea of you poured the oil on the head and it went down the beard. Kings eventually became anointed, right? Samuel anoints Saul and he anoints David, and every king since then gets anointed. What is super cool, though, about verse 2, remember the parallelism we talked about? Two different ways of saying the same thing. You got kings of the earth and the rulers. Those are the same things. You got set themselves and take counsel together. Those are the same thing. What about Lord and his anointed? Those are kind of the same thing. So this king is going to be more than just someone like David. This king is described in language that puts him on par with God himself. Like a son of God, literally, in some way of putting that. Helps you understand why they were so upset with Jesus when he ran around saying, I'm God's son. Because God's son is supposed to be this guy, this ruling, conquering king. What do you mean you're God's son? You can't say stuff like that, right? You can understand why they would have been so upset about it. But little did they know how right they were. I mean, he was God's son, but he wasn't the one they expected. Okay, application to us time. I'm going to run through the same sorts of things, but I'm going to go forward into some other texts. Revelation came to mind often, just in thinking about how this applies to us. I like Revelation 6 here, beginning there in verse 12. When we went through Revelation 5, 6, and 7, we talked about the seals and how the seals were a sort of a representation of everything that's going to happen leading up to judgment. The last thing that happens leading up to judgment, the sixth seal, is when there's the great earthquake. You get the cataclysmic language. The stars are falling, the moon is falling, everything's falling. In verse 15, the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains, calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath